Welcome to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and it's my privilege today to have John Carroll. John's great passion is for the two ships in life, discipleship and relationship. He's perfect for the podcast because he puts those things together in a way where Christian spirituality and ecclesiology meet one another. He's presently the director of the School of Kingdom Living for Dallas Willard Ministries, and his most recent experience before that was he served as in a similar role for the Apprentice Institute for Christian Spiritual Formation in Wichita, Kansas, as well as the teaching pastor at Hope Covenant Church. John is a graduate of Asbury Theological Seminary with the Masters of Divinity, and he's going to be ordained in the Evangelical Covenant Church. He and his wife, Amber, have two teenage children, and they're presently residing in Melbourne, Florida. John, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. It's good to be with you and with your audience.
Well, let's just jump right into things. I mean, we have so many mutual interests, but I think a great way to introduce you to the audience is to invite you to share a few moments, a few key moments in your journey that led you to ministry and to your particular emphasis and passion for deep spiritual formation.
Yeah, gosh, there's so many different moments that I could cite, but really, a long time ago, I was working in corporate healthcare, and at the time, I was volunteering in the church, and God was really actively involved in my life. I mean, I definitely felt God was on the move, and I was really passionate about my faith, but I just didn't think that it was possible to leave my job. But then there was this moment, and I remember it clearly. It was October 2008, and I was working in my healthcare job, and I was the first one in the office. And the rule in that office was that if you're the first one there, you got to brew the pot of coffee for everybody. And so I brew the pot of coffee, and I pour myself a cup, and I sit down at my desk. And I was looking around my office, and on the office walls, there were all these plaques and awards that I had earned over my career in working in this entrepreneurial healthcare environment. And I heard God audibly say, "John, this isn't what you're supposed to be doing with your life." And it really caught me off guard. And I was excited to talk to my wife, Amber. And so I gave her a call on my way home from work that day. And she said, "What's going on?" And I said, "I think I want to quit my job." And she goes, "Awesome. What happened?" See, because Amber knew that God was stirring in me. And so she was really excited about, what was happening. And I said, "I think I'm being called to full-time ministry." And she's like, "Well, what does that mean?" It's like, "Well, I think it means seminary." And so we had a real long conversation that night. And that's when really God flung open the doors for me to pursue my calling. We had some friends from our church that we were a part of. They came over to our house and invited us to sell our house and sell our things and move in with them so that I could quit my job and go to seminary full time. And really, that's what we did. And in March 2009, we just unloaded everything and we moved in with them. There was the four of us, and we moved in with the five of them. So there was 9 of us doing community living, and it was like a literal following of the rich young ruler story. And we just unloaded it all and shared everything that I had in common. So it was kind of a blend of that Acts 2 narrative as well. And so we ended up doing over 4 years of community living before and while I was getting my M.Div at Asbury. And by the way, it's really funny. As I was thinking about that story, I actually included that story in my application for the Callis scholarship that Asbury offers. And I ended up getting the scholarship, which paid for nearly all of my seminary education. That's kind of cool.
It is. It is.
So that was one moment that immediately comes to mind when I think about what led me into ministry. I think another moment happened in 2009, on December 2009 to be exact. I was driving into my corporate healthcare job, and I was listening to a podcast, and Pastor John Ortberg was interviewing Dallas Willard, and John was asking a question kind of on behalf of somebody else who had sort of submitted the question, but John asked, "Why is Jesus a big deal if I believe in God?" And if he is such a big deal, how would you advise me to experience him? And Dallas thought about it for a moment, and then he said, don't start by trying to believe the big truths about Jesus. Start by simply putting into practice the things he said, trusting him to be right about it. And if you do that, then you'll gradually find out what a big deal he is. And when Dallas said that, I remember exactly where I was. I was on the corner of US 1 and Sarno Road in Melbourne, and I pulled my car over into a gas station, and I rewound the podcast, and I wrote down in a little journal that exact quote, because that really impacted me. And I would say that was the thing that really shifted my understanding of spiritual formation. And I think that there was a shift in my mind about knowing about God, which is more like head knowledge, to really knowing God and experiencing God in a lived reality. And so I said, all right, I've got to begin living out the teachings of Jesus so that I can find out what he's really like. Yeah. And I think Dallas would say, belief is not something that you can do by choice. It comes as a result of finding reality. And I think that's what I was trying to get after.
Why do you think, I don't want to interrupt your story here, but that's a powerful quotation. And I guess this happened, you were in your early 30s, I guess, when we're talking about that. Yeah. So what do you think you missed early on that didn't quite connect the head with the practices, if you will? And how have you found that you've been able to help other people to maybe make that connection quicker?
I would say that before I heard that, I think I was just trying to be able to rattle off Bible verses. Mm-hmm. And I think I wanted to be able to impress people with what I knew, but it didn't really connect to the heart level, and it didn't really invade how I was living my life. It didn't really change me. It was just all information that I was storing up top. And it really didn't manifest itself in my hands and feet. And so that's really part of my, when I talk about, my great passions are discipleship and relationship. I want to help people experience that and say, it's not just about what you know, it's really how you're living it out. And so, another really great quote from Dallas, he said, the most important thing about a person is not what you do, it's who you become, because that's what we take into eternity. And so we're trying to become like Jesus. And really and the only way that you can do that is by doing the things that he taught and just trusting him to be right about it. And it's this process that will eventually help us discover that.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great quotation. And, and just speaking of, you've had the privilege now in your work in spiritual formation. You work with James Bryan Smith, who some of our listeners will be familiar with. So you can say a little bit about him at the Apprentice Institute. And now you're actually directing a school at the Kingdom Living for Dallas Willard, his ministries. And of course, he passed away. But again, there's just two giants there. So, you've shared a couple things about Dallas Willard. Maybe there's some others, but what are some of the real lessons that you glean from, again, I hesitate to say giant in spiritual formation, but really powerful, well-known mentors who have helped a lot of people? What did you learn from maybe these two, related but different streams of spiritual formation?
Yeah. Jim's such an incredible person. I'll always be grateful for what I learned from Jim. Jim had kind of and that's what we call him, James Bryan Smith. I mean, nobody calls him James Bryan Smith except people who read his books. And so if you know him, you call him Jim. Okay. And Jim has said that he considers himself the Forrest Gump of spiritual formation, because his life journey just had him intersecting with all these really incredible people, such as Dallas Willard. Jim was Dallas's teaching assistant at Fuller Seminary. Dallas taught in the D-Min program. It was a spirituality and ministry class, and Jim was his TA for 8 years, and so got to study under Dallas in that way. And Jim also studied under Richard Foster when Richard was a professor at Friends University in Wichita. And then when Jim became a working adult and after college and stuff, he and Richard started Renovare in 1988 together. at Friends University. So Jim's life is intersected with some pretty incredible people. And I remember I was at a conference in Wichita at Friends University in September 2012. And I was on my way to grab lunch at the school cafeteria, and Jim grabbed me and said, "Hey, do you want to go grab lunch together?" I said, "Sure." And so we're having this conversation at this little barbecue spot right around the corner from campus. And I'll never forget it. He said, "I want to invest in you." And I'm like, "Great, that's good, okay." And I just was dumbfounded. I wasn't sure what to say. But I do remember going back to campus, and he went one way and I went another. And I called Amber on the phone. I said, "You're not going to believe this, but James Bryan Smith says that he wants to invest in me." She goes, "Oh my gosh, this is amazing. What does that mean?" I said, "I don't know, but it's got to be good, right?" And so that really started a series of conversations between me and Jim, where he's going, "I need to get you on my team. I need to find a way to bring you here." And he said, "You've got this really cool background, this entrepreneurial experience. And so you know how to build stuff, but you've got the M.Div, you work in the church, you understand how that world works as well. Like you've got this really great blend. I want you on my team." And so he hired me, and I worked with Jim at the Apprentice Institute for over 6 years. And we did incredible ministry together. And I got to see really firsthand how his books impacted people's lives. Jim has written a lot about narratives, and primarily he's written a lot about narratives in his 3-book trilogy called the Apprentice series. It's The Good and Beautiful God, The Good and Beautiful Life, and The Good and Beautiful Community. And in those books, he contends that there is a false narrative that exists that kind of runs and ruins our lives. But then there's this Jesus narrative, or a true narrative that corrects our thinking and behaving. And so I grew up in a Baptist church, and I know that Baptists get a bad rap for the angry God narrative, and sometimes, rightly so. But I didn't grow up believing that God was mad at me. God's not up in heaven eating antacids at the way that I'm living my life. And so I don't know if that's because I just happened to be at the right Baptist church, or maybe I wasn't paying close enough attention. But nonetheless, I believe that God loved me and was out for my good. And so while working at the Apprentice Institute, I talked with countless people, and many of them were pastors, some people like in their 50s and 60s, and they still suffer from this false narrative that God is out to get them.
Yeah.
And I had one pastor who came to me in 2015 with like literally tears in his eyes. And this guy's been in ministry for decades. And he said, "I can't believe that I've gone my whole life believing that God's pissed off at me." And that really blew my mind.
So when somebody says something like that to you, then what comes to mind? How have you found spiritual formation helpful for that kind of person? Because again, I think maybe this gets to the dark side. It's actually interesting. I found that sometimes we get into spiritual formation, and I like to always give people warnings. Like, I love centering prayer, but I think centering prayer, it'll mess with you. It's like, I think long term it's awesome, but it messes with you because you got to come face to face with your own. The early church called them demons, whether you believe they're actually demons or not, but you actually come face to face with yourself, is what I would say. And so you're like, this person's obviously broke. Some of the spiritual formation practices, it breaks you open. You become raw. You become vulnerable. There seems like there's a danger there, but there's also a blessing if you push through. So, what have you found that helps a person, like you just said, who says something about God? What are your next steps? And I'm sure you have lots of stories like that. What have you learned about those sorts of encounters?
Well, I definitely think that it will rock people's boats, but I think that people are maybe at a subconscious level, they're kind of hoping, and wishing, like they've been hoping and wishing all along that God is out for their good. And so when they hear that, I think that drives them into learning more about like really what that means. And I think that there are a lot of scripture passages, too many to cite in our conversation today, but there are a lot of passages that become illuminated where they say, "Oh, well, maybe maybe God isn't out to get me. Maybe God isn't like the angry judge or the mad dad, but maybe God really does love me. And love, I would say is, to will the good of another person. I think God wants the very best for us. I think God desperately wants to be in a relationship with us. And so I think that in order to be in any kind of a healthy relationship with someone, there has to be conversation. So I think prayer, chief means of grace, prayer would be a way to start an interactive and conversational relationship with God. And I know, personally speaking, I mean, that's been one of the things that has really helped transform my own journey, is just, having this long conversation with God, never really hanging up the phone, just sort of going, hey, I need to talk to you about something.
Well, that's really good. And the very next question I wanted to ask you are like, what are key aspects that you've discovered for teaching deep spiritual formation? And I know you developed a process when you were working at the Apprentice Institute, and I know you're building a similar program now, or something like it for Dallas Willard. They're not going to be exactly the same things, but what are like rock bottom, or what are building blocks that for you are just the core pieces if you're going to set up a program, whether it's related to a university or a ministry, or even if you're a local church pastor? What are the building blocks that you would find it to be essential for not only teaching, but for helping people to experience deep spiritual formation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I'll talk a little bit about the School of Kingdom Living and what our approach is. And so the School of Kingdom Living, it's an 18-month journey in Christ-centered learning and training in community. And so that's what we do, and I'll unpack that a little bit. And so we have these 4-week-long residencies over an 18-month period. And the cohort is made up of people who come from all different parts of the United States. They come even from outside the United States. And we study together how to develop an interactive relationship with God, how to experience kingdom living now, and then we'll also the process of character formation into Christ likeness. And then we also talk about the role of spiritual practices in our everyday lives, the things that we just incorporate, that they just become a part of who we are. And so we gather at a retreat center, and it's a really great setting to just kind of escape the noise of our world and connect with God and each other. But I would say the thing that makes the program really special is that it's not just about coming in and listening to a bunch of lectures and taking notes. The instructors give lectures, but those lectures are frequently followed up by spiritual practices or soul training exercises that connect to the lectures. And then after the lectures, then we'll give feedback about our experience with that practice as a group. And so the idea is that you hear it in the lecture, and then you do it in the practice. You actually experience it, and then you process it in community with other people. And really, that's what we have discovered to be a reliable model of transformation. It's the hearing and the doing and the processing in community that really makes it special.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, like I always talk about, the thing that's helped me in spiritual formation, or even in my own faith, is, I've been teaching the seminary for, this is my 23rd year, and, I've been a pastor, and, I can theologize with the best of them or whatever, and, go on my YouTube channel. You're going to go on and you can watch hours and hours of me talking about scripture and stuff. And so I've always been pretty good at the what.
Yeah.
Right. I think what I love, what I just heard you say, and I think this is so critical for all our listeners, and why I really wanted you on here, is, the what will get you a long way. You'll even get, if you're a pastor, hey, that was a great sermon. You showed me something interesting in the Bible. But then at some point you got to man, I don't want to show people interesting things in the Bible.
Yeah.
I don't even want people to be able to, just describe and say what the what is. What I heard you actually talking about is the how. And I think you hit really two great points. You have to experience the how individually, but then you've actually blocked in this communal connection as well, right? Because we have such a temptation today to separate spirituality. And now I'm thinking the broader culture from actually from or work or any piece else, but you're holding those together by emphasizing, correct the what thinking. Again, everything I just said, I'm not putting down the need to study carefully, but we have to experience that personally. But even then, it has to be beyond ourselves. It's going to go on to a group. So, what led you to, again, maybe this is probably not a new insight, but what really helped to reinforce this model that spiritual formation isn't just an individual practice, it has to be corporate?
Well, I would say that, hearing the stories of people who come into our program, people would say, I have a deep love of spiritual formation. I'd read a lot of books by Willard and Foster and Smith and Eugene Peterson and Henry Nouwen. And I get really excited about it, but there was nobody really to talk to about what I'm learning and how I'm growing. And so people would say, this journey, this process of Christ-likeness felt really lonely. So when people would come into the program, they would start to be able to have dialogue about the things that are really getting their heart beating fast. And it never failed. And like this, the third or fourth day of our first residency, people pull me aside and say, like, this is so amazing. This is the group I've been searching for my entire life. And I think that what they're discovered is that, spiritual formation apart from community is really hard. We need people to give us feedback on how things are going. We need to be able to share and to be vulnerable. And there's a lot of spiritual practices that you can't really do on your own. I mean, you can confess to God, but I think that, confession as a spiritual discipline, a spiritual practice, is very effective when you're confessing to a close accountability partner. And so you need community.
And talk about, to me, again, I didn't ask you this question, Vance. This just pops this has just popped in my head. I mean, we're recording this, so, hopefully everything is better by the time other people are listening to this, but we're still in this COVID-19 oddity where it's been a real challenge to do face-to-face stuff. And even if you do, we got masks on, we're sitting 6 feet apart and, the whole element, maybe if you've thought about this, what's the opportunity for spiritual formation now? In a sense, we're all in solitude, which is interesting, right? So there's that individual piece that we could enhance, but then many of us are longing for, beyond just the Zoom call, you can, do some stuff group that way, but we're longing for community. What's as a spiritual formation teacher, how have you processed this time of maybe unintentional silence and solitude?
Well, I would say that the amount of silence and solitude that we've experienced in this COVID season over the last 6 or 7 months has really done a number on people's spiritual lives. I think it's really rocked them. I hear that people are just starving for connection. And I would say that even with the distancing and the sheltering at home and different practices that we've had, I still think that we're still able to gather, even in a small group, maybe even 2 or 3 people, just to connect. And I think it's really important to say, okay, if I can't get together with a big group, at least get together with a small group. I mean, Personally, I think the small groups are the most effective ones anyway.
So that's good.
I think that to really kind of open yourself up and be vulnerable only really happens with a few people. And so I think that spiritual formation in this kind of COVID season and gosh, Lord willing, hopefully this will be over really soon. But until it ends, I think that it's important for people to reach out and say, hey, can we get together in a sort of responsible way where we're not going to take unnecessary risk, but let's get together and still connect in community.
Okay, that's good. And just as we kind of move on in the conversation, you've been, again, working with groups. I mean, you grew up in the Methodist Church, and we've talked, and I mean, you still have your really deep Wesleyan roots, and it's not like Willard and James Bryan Smith are anti-Wesleyan or anti-pietist. But what have you discovered from working with groups that are outside the kind of official Methodist family that have helped you to appreciate maybe more your Wesleyan theological and spiritual roots.
Yeah, no, I mean, and one of the really refreshing things, like little confession here, I didn't know a ton about John Wesley before I started at Asbury. But my time at Asbury, I mean, I fell in love with Wesley. I mean, I just was like, man, this guy was on fire. He had so much right. And so I was really delighted, as I dove into Willard. I mean, Dallas talked about Wesley from time to time. And Jim Smith is ordained in the UMC. And so I definitely was around him there. But I would say that in terms of groups outside of my Wesleyan tradition, while living in Kansas, I definitely appreciated the Wesleyan egalitarian approach to ministry. My wife, Amber, and I, we're pastors in the Evangelical Covenant Church. That's our denomination. And for 4 years, we co-pastored a church in a town called El Dorado. It's a little bedroom community outside of Wichita. And Amber was the lead pastor, full-time lead pastor, and I was part-time teaching pastor because I still held my role with the Apprentice Institute. And now, here in Florida, it wasn't really uncommon to see women in leadership positions, but it's a different story in that part of the Midwest. And Amber ran into a lot of opposition while leading a church in that town. In fact, the planting pastor of our church took a different role in the denomination about 9 years after he planted the church. And so the congregation started looking for a new pastor. And that's when they discovered that the covenant affirms women in pastoral leadership. And that discovery completely split the church.
Wow.
Half the congregation was so up in arms about just the potential of a female leading them that half the congregation left. And so they ended up hiring another male pastor to lead the church, and he was there for 3 years. He kind of inherited a difficult, real challenging situation because the church was so up in arms. And so he was in that role from 2013 to 2016. And so Amber and I started at that church in August of 2016, and when we did, it was on the verge of closing its doors. I mean, it just was trending in the wrong direction. And so we met with church leaders, and we gave a fresh vision for ministry, and we replanted the church. And the really cool thing is that God was blessing our efforts. I mean, left and right, and good things were happening in the church. Experienced healing in the midst of that. We experienced growth. We experienced vitality. And so you can imagine how gratifying it was for the people who stuck it out to say that a woman led them out of a dark place.
That's awesome. Yeah.
I mean, that was really special. And that church still holds a really special place in our hearts. And we're going to cherish that experience for the rest of our lives, for sure. But definitely that was a shift for us living in the Midwest.
No, and that's a good word to again, everybody listening to the podcast. Again, if you've grown up in United Methodism in certain places, there's always been in the Wesleyan movement a real appreciation for the role and contribution of women in ministry, including in leadership roles. The United Methodist Church is kind of late to the party. Go back into the holiness movement, you really see that dynamic role. So it is, but there are places where that's still a challenge. And so, thanks for the witness to that. How else have you seen Wesleyans contributing to the spiritual formation conversation?
Well, John Wesley had a thing where he said, there's no holiness apart from social holiness.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
And so I think that, Wesleyan spirituality, and really in particular, the efforts of John and Charles Wesley, had it right with their models of societies and classes and bands. I mean, that way of being in community with one another, I think was really an effective model of ministry. And I'm not sure what portion of your listening audience is familiar with those three different entities. So I can dive into just a brief little description of each if that would be helpful.
Well, you can talk. I mean, I've had Kevin Watson and Andrew Thompson who have books on the class meeting structures, and actually Ryan Danker. So if they want a deep dive, they can go back and listen to the 3 entire episodes. But talk a little bit though. I don't want to cut off the thought.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
from your own perspective and how you've seen that work, what is your understanding about why those were so important?
Yeah.
Maybe,
Well,
especially we see many of our listeners, they're having revivals of these. I know so many people that are in bands now and they're trying to get to small groups. So, how have you seen that to be critical?
yeah. Well, the societies were the large gatherings, and then the class meetings were like the 10 to 12 people, and then the bands were the real small groups, a lot more intimate. And with each sort of gathering, it became a lot more intimate, a lot more, vulnerability there. And so I think the societies were able to capture a large group of people, and sort of that was like the first tier of spiritual accountability. And so it's like, hey, come on in. And then, okay, if you really want to get serious, then you're going to get into a class meeting. And these people were really committed to their faith. And the great thing about the class meetings is that there was a cross section of the society. You had an upper class with lower class, you had educated with non-educated. And so I loved Wesley's vision for that, because I think that it's kind of it's a vision for what Jesus had in mind for the kingdom of God. And so I think that's really special. But the bands, the smallest groups, I just think that we need that kind of accountability in our lives. I think that we need people who are there to encourage us, because life can be hard sometimes, and so we need encouragement, and we also need accountability in case we start going off the rails. I mean, I think that one of the really great stories, I was at a conference not too long ago, and I was listening to a professor from Azusa Pacific University talk, and he was talking about accountability, and he was telling the story about how he had a really good friend of his, and they sort of drifted away. They lost touch, but they had been friends for a real long time. And so he called his friend one day when he wasn't doing well, and his friend picked up the phone, and when he said hello, his friend said, "What's wrong?" Like, just with that one word, he knew that his friend wasn't doing well. And when I was sitting in that conference, it really rocked me to my core, because I started thinking, like, who in my life knows me that well? I mean, maybe outside of my wife, and where I could say one word and they would know how I'm doing. And I think that's the kind of relationship that we all really ought to be looking for. Just maybe find one person that we have that kind of accountability with, who can journey with us and encourage us along the way.
Just tips, because that's such a great testimony right there, and it's a great encouragement. So somebody's listening and they're, maybe feeling lonely. What advice do you have? I mean, you've met people that have been looking for groups. If somebody's looking for a group, do they usually just find it, or what are tips if you're not in a cohort or something? How does one go about finding persons to do really deep community with? What are you looking for when you're trying to find such a person?
That's a good question too. I think that it's going to require a lot of conversations.
Yeah.
I think that's just going to have to be on the top of your mind and the tip of your tongue, where, you're ready to, have a conversation around maybe what you're looking for, and testing the waters to see if other people are looking for it too. And I think that it's good to talk about, really, like, in practical terms, what you want that relationship to look like. To say, hey, like, I know this may be awkward, but I want you to call me out on the carpet if something in my life doesn't seem right. Like, if you see me drifting into sin, I need you to be the kind of friend to say, hang on, and pull me back. I think that it's particularly tough in this cultural moment that we're living in, I think, because we live in a hyper-individualized society that also, I think social media has a lot to do with this. I think that, we've become really concerned about image management. And so only the best aspects of our lives make it on the social media, and the best aspects of other people's lives make it on the social media. And so we have this sort of veneer, this mask, that we live with. Kind of reminds me of the story about this guy. He lost his job, and he's searching for searching in the classifieds for a job, and couldn't really find anything. And finally, there was an advertisement from a zoo that said that we need somebody to audition to be a gorilla in our zoo. So he goes in, he applies for the job, goes in for the interview, and the guy's like, okay, well, this is the job. We want you to dress up in this gorilla suit, get in the cage, beat your chest and swing around, all that stuff. And the guy's like, well, this is kind of embarrassing, but I'll go ahead. I'm desperate. I need the job. And so he gets into his gorilla habitat, and he's got the suit on, and he's, beating his chest and swinging around. And the people who are there to attend the zoo, they're really loving what he's doing, and he gets a little carried away. And so he's swinging on the vine. He actually swings into the habitat next to him, which is where the lion is. And within a second, the lion pounces on the guy, puts his paw on the guy's chest, and the guy starts to panic. And he's like, help, help. And the lion says, shut up, you idiot, or we'll both lose our jobs. And I think in a way, we all wear masks. Yeah. And I think that's the real challenge for us today, is to take off the mask and just allow ourselves to really be known by other people, because that's really the only real pathway to community and formation.
Yeah, that's really good. And that leads to the really last big question that I wanted to cover with you, which is the whole issue of Christian holiness. Wesley talked about it: Christian perfection, entire sanctification. It's loving God with your whole heart and your whole soul, your whole mind, all that you have, and loving your neighbor as yourself. In a sense, you just described, community. So how has your work in spiritual formation shaped how you think and maybe even talk about entire sanctification, growth, and grace?
Yeah. Well, I would start by saying that, like, one of my very favorite people on the planet is a woman by the name of Jan Johnson. She's an author and spiritual director and just an incredible human being. And she's really shaped my practical application of spiritual formation, because, the reality is spiritual formation is slow, like a crock pot.
Yeah.
However, like, I want it to be more like a microwave, like quick and, delivered in an instant.
Right.
And so character formation into Christ likeness is really a long, long journey. We go down this long and windy and rocky path, and sometimes that causes me to stumble and lose my footing, and I get frustrated and I feel like giving up. And then Jan reminds me, this great thing. She says, do it as you can, not as you can't.
That's
and
good, isn't it?
What she means is, don't be discouraged by what you didn't do or what you didn't experience. Stay focused on what worked for you and keep moving forward. And so I think that really connects with Wesley's thoughts on Christian perfection and holiness.
That's good.
Being perfect, according to Wesley, doesn't mean that my life has to be free from mistakes or free from temptation or free from ignorance. It really means that I've dedicated my life to following the great commandment of loving God and loving my neighbor as myself, like you said. And so I think it's that kind of lifelong commitment that requires me to constantly rely on God's grace.
And how does spiritual formation practices challenge someone? Because, it's pretty easy, I think, for us to think that, hey, I love my neighbor, I love God. Then we can look around and see evidences of how that perhaps isn't true. How does spiritual formation open up blind spots and get into the nook and crannies of our lives, so that when we really talk about holiness and stuff, and even there's no question that we make mistakes, that it's not like we're going to be sinless, and that's not what the Wesleys were talking about. But
yeah,
how does spiritual formation open us up to deeper levels of that experience? And so, yeah, we still have mistakes. There's still unintentional aspects of our lives, but those can become rarer, and we really beam the love of Jesus more and more, even sometimes even on our bad days, we can do that, not just on the good days. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or
Yeah. I mean, I would say that it's connected to our understanding of grace. A lot of times, we think about grace as unmerited favor, but really, grace is, God's activity in my life to help me accomplish that which I cannot do on my own. And so I think that, with spiritual formation, it's helpful to have a deeper understanding of grace in our life, to say, I'm going to rely on God to help me in this moment, that I realize that I cannot do this on my own. I think that, that's sort of the lie that we buy into. And I think a big part of spiritual formation is really, it's dealing with self-deception.
mm-hmm.
There are a lot of things that we tell ourselves that aren't true, and there are lies that we tell ourselves that just kind of help us get by in life. But really, when you can come face to face, with this idea that, like, hey, I don't need to have it all together, and that I can rely on God to help me with that. I think that we're on our way to healthy spiritual formation. I love what Dallas has to say. It's one of my favorite thoughts from Dallas. He talks about it in his book, The Great Omission, which is kind of a play on words, in the Great Commission. So he's talking about, discipleship. And in The Great Omission, he says, the true saint burns grace like a 747 jet burns jet fuel on takeoff. I mean, just that thought alone, you're like, well, what the heck does he mean? He says, become the kind of person who routinely does what Jesus did and said. You'll consume much more grace by leading a holy life than you will by sinning, because every holy act you will do will have to be upheld by the grace of God. And so I think that, with spiritual formation and following Jesus, apprenticing Jesus at a deep level, I think that it's good for us to remember that we don't have to have it all together the same way the disciples didn't have it all together, but they still responded to that call to follow.
No, that was really good. And I think that was a great quotation. I'm going to have you send that to me because I like to post that, I think, somewhere. But just to kind of wrap up, I want to ask you the questions I always ask everybody that comes on. First one, and you've mentioned some books as we've gone and some authors, but what are 2 to 3 books outside of the Bible that have really shaped you deeply?
Yeah. Well, I'd say the first book that I'll talk about is really the first Christian book that grabbed my attention in 2007. Shane Claiborne wrote a book called Irresistible Revolution. And when I read that book, I was really surprised at how quickly I would have to put into practice some of the things that he talked about, like loving my enemies and blessing those who persecute you.
Yes.
And I had an experience around that we don't have time to go into today, but it was literally the month after I finished the book where I had this opportunity to bless somebody who was persecuting me and my whole family. And I responded in a way that I think Jesus would have responded. And I noticed that, like, wow, I mean, I have a great responsibility, to live out the teachings of Jesus. And that really catalyzed my calling. And so that would be the first book. The second book would be Renovation of the Heart by Dallas Willard. Dallas has this amazing model for character formation in chapter 5 called Vision, Intention, and Means. They're talking about having a vision for formation and the intention, the desire that will help you pursue that. And then you have to have the means, the activities and the tools that will help you pursue that vision for formation. That really was powerful for me. And then the third book, just real quickly too, would be Brian Zond wrote a book called Water to Wine. And really it's just a slice of his story, but he was pastoring a church in Missouri, and the way he described it was kind of like that bubblegum kind of Christianity. And then he had this moment where he said, I need to really take my congregation deeper. He felt the real need to do that. And so he tells his story. And I think as a pastor, it really connected with me. I think as a pastor, I've been even, guilty of getting caught up in the ABCs of the church world, the attendance, building, and cash, and while neglecting the D, and that's discipleship.
That's good.
And so that it really helped encourage me along the way as well.
Okay. And how do you ground your own life? What does, again, we know that spiritual formation practices, they may change with seasons, but like, what are you doing right now? What does your rhythm look like?
Yeah, I exercise at least 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. I take the weekend off, but I'm pretty consistent with my exercise, just caring for my physical body. But I also love to read. I've got a little space in my office that I'll just sit in an oversized chair and read for a little bit. Sometimes it's 30 minutes, sometimes it's an hour, just depending on what I've got going on. But very consistent with that, and I feel like that really helps get my day started right. The physical activity and the reading, whether it's scripture or a book or something that is on my desk. I would also say that making my family a priority has been really life-giving, and just being attentive. I've got 2 teenagers, and as anybody who has teenagers know, that can be a real challenge. They're on the go, but I love connecting with my kids and just having a great time with them and spending time with my wife and being connected with her. I'm also an Enneatype 3. I'm a 3 with a 2 wing is what my Enneagram type is. And so the biggest challenge for me as a 3 is Sabbath. Mm-hmm. And so I struggled with that mightily. A really great book on Sabbath is by A.J. Swoboda. I don't know if you've read his book, Subversive Sabbath, but that's a really great book in case anybody out there is struggling with Sabbath. And so I actually talked to my spiritual director, this really great dude. And this guy's like, the Yoda of spiritual direction. His name's Matt Johnson. He is in Wichita. And so he really helped me with Sabbath. And, he talked about developing a rhythm of Sabbath where, maybe I've got some things to do around the house. Maybe, for instance, picking weeds in the garden. He said, just pick weeds until you don't feel like picking them anymore, but don't have any guilt about not doing it. Just, set it down. And so he taught me this phrase, and Amber and I put it into our calendar at 5:00. It pops up on our phone at 5:00 every Friday night, and it goes all the way till 5:00 on Saturday afternoon. And it says, Sabbath. If it feels like work, stop. And that's been just a really great reminder. So 5:00 on Friday, I'm just going to set it down and trust that God will continue to work when I don't.
That's good. It's really good. Yeah, and where can folks find out more if they're interested in your work with Dallas Willard? I'll post everything in the notes. But how can listeners find out more about you, about the work that you're doing with Dallas Willard with the School for Kingdom Living?
Yeah, you can go to our website. It's dwillard.org. And so there's a contact page on there. They can reach out to me, and I check that all the time. So I would love to connect with anybody if they want to talk a little bit more about the School of Kingdom Living. They just want to talk about spiritual formation in general. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, obviously. And if your listeners are in the Central Florida area and they want to connect, I'd love to meet up and grab a cup of coffee and hang out.
Oh, that sounds great. Well, hopefully some folks will take you up on that. Again, welcome back to Florida. I know you've been back here for a short time. It's a great state, and you live over there even close to the beach, which is wonderful. And John, just thank you so much. It's a privilege having you as a friend. I'm grateful for the work that you do in spiritual formation, and grateful for the work that does long term as the folks that you serve then can begin to serve others and create a movement that really does change the world. So thank you for being faithful to your calling.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me on the podcast. It's been a real joy. It's good to reconnect with you. We had a really great time in seminary together, and I appreciate your work in helping to lead and train the next generation of ministry leaders and pastors.
Well, thank you, John, and friends. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. And until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be voices of hope to others. Amen. Hey, I'm Brian Russell, and thank you so much for listening all the way to the end of this episode of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. If you've enjoyed the episode, I'd invite you to share it with your friends. If you have time, I'd love and be grateful if you could leave a really good review wherever you've found this content. I also would remind you, if you're interested in looking at some of the resources that were mentioned during this episode, you can check the show notes out and there's affiliate links to Amazon. If you purchase through those links, it doesn't change the cost of the items to you, but it sends a little bit back my way, which can help and go and support this podcast, the recording, and the space that I use on the internet. And also, if you're interested, and if you're a spiritual leader and you would like to do a deep dive, I have a program that I've designed for pastors. It's called Deep Dive Spirituality Group Coaching. You work directly with me in small groups with like-minded men and women. If you'd be interested in that, you can check that out at deepdivespirituality.com. If you have any questions and I can be of any service, my email is deepdivespirituality@gmail.com. So if you just want some information, deepdivespirituality.com, or reach out to me, deepdivespirituality@gmail.com. Thank you so much, and it's a real privilege to have you as a listener.